Well, good afternoon. I'm Susan Karamanian, the Dean of the College of Law at Hamad bin Khalifa University. On behalf of HBKU Law, as well as our co-organizer of this event, the Qatar Lawyers Association, as well as our co-sponsors, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this roundtable discussion on recent developments in sports law in Qatar. Our co-sponsors are Sultan Al-Abdulla Partners. Thank you so much, particularly to Michael Early and his team for coordinating a lot of this. Al-Ansari Associates, and we happen to be very lucky to have Salman Al-Ansari with us. Thank you so much, Salman. McNair Chambers, and Zachary has a position in McNair Chambers. Thank you so much. And of course, with Sultan Thomas Williams, I'll introduce in a minute. And also Dr. Muna Al-Marzouqi, who is with us from the Dr. Muna Al-Marzouqi Law Firm. This is an important day for us because it's the eve of Qatar's National Sports Day, which Qatar celebrates the second Tuesday of February every year. And we are encouraged to participate in sports tomorrow with our colleagues and family and friends. It's also the first full week of the Beijing Winter Olympics. And here in Qatar, we're getting ready for FIFA World Cup 2022, scheduled for November 21st through December 18th. I think it's only fitting then that we have the opportunity to take stock about developments in sports law. And I'm delighted we have outstanding panelists with us, experts in sports in Qatar, to help us explore a range of issues, whether it be new laws here in Qatar relating to sports or the World Cup, issues unique to major sports events, such as the World Cup itself, the legacy of these events, and sports disputes. Before I introduce our panelists, and I will be very brief in the introduction, I would like to let the audience know that we have interpretation, simultaneous interpretation. In the bottom right screen, you'll see the globe, and it has interpretation. So we will be speaking in English, but you'll be able to get the benefit of that in Arabic through the interpretation. And of course, if somebody wants to speak in Arabic, we'll switch over to the English in interpretation. The format today is a roundtable conversation, and I will pose a question to one of the panelists, and then the panelists will have the opportunity to provide an answer. And then after that, we will have input from the other panelists, and then move on to another panelist with a principal question. And today we have with us a distinguished panel who are, members are very well steeped in sports law and sports in general here in Qatar. And the first one is Salman Al-Ansari, who, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, is a partner in Al-Ansari and Associates. And Salman comes to sports law with unique background, having played on the national team here. And then I'm also delighted to have from HBKU's College of Science and Engineering, Dr. Camilla Suarez, who has brought to Qatar her knowledge about major sports events from South Africa, and she is teaching in our sports management program and also helping lead that program. We're still waiting on Faisal Zainal, project manager at the Aspire Zone Foundation, to join us, but he's going to be with us this afternoon. Dr. Muna Al-Marzouqi, I mentioned her a few minutes ago, a lawyer here in town, but also the Associate Vice President for Academic Planning and Quality Assurance at Qatar University. Dr. Muna, wonderful to have you with us today. And then my colleague who teaches sports law and also is active in resolution of sports disputes, Dr. Zachary Calo. Good afternoon, Dr. Calo. And then finally, Thomas Williams, who is a partner at Sultan Al-Abdulla Partners and who is an expert in dispute resolution. So thank you so much to each of our panelists for being with us today. And I'd also like to thank our interpreters for helping us this afternoon. Salman, can I start with you? You've been at the forefront of legal developments here in Qatar, including new laws or relevant laws and perhaps building of institutions and the like in advance of FIFA World Cup 2022. Can you just give us an overview of some of these developments and their significance?
Well, thank you, Susan, first of all, and I thank my colleagues and the distinguished panelists today. Well, Susan, as you know, I mean, the whole world know that we are in the countdown for the World Cup. It's been a very long 12 years for the nation. The nation had a lot of developments in the legal infrastructure. What we call the end result of that preparation is the FIFA Law, which was issued last year. That law was basically in the preparation since 2015. We were privileged to be part of the team who worked on it. To understand how the law came to effect, it's important to understand that each nation which actually bid for the World Cup had to sign government guarantees. They had the opportunity to review the host agreement and the annexes to that. And these guarantees focus on certain aspects like immigration, working, IP rights of FIFA, commercial rights of FIFA. And the law that was issued last year was the result of that. In 2015, the work kicked off with a gap analysis of our a full review of our legislation in the country and comparing that to the government guarantees and the hosting agreement that the country entered into to find the gaps in our legislation, which the main purpose of this law is to bridge issues around, for example, ambush marketing. Ambush marketing is not regulated in the country. It's not an issue, actually, in sports events in the country. It is the first time that is being regulated at this stage. Tickets, resale of tickets as well. It's not a crime in the country, so it was not regulated criminally per se. Now it's been regulated through this law. Once the law was issued, there are a lot of decisions that are following, and supposedly some of them are going to be issued very soon. For each entity, each government organization that has something to do with it, from tax, customs, telecommunications, banking, immigration, all of these aspects. It should be a fantastic and smooth World Cup based on the legal work that was done. The goal was to facilitate a good experience for everyone.
That's great. If I could follow up with a question and invite my colleagues on the panel as well to chime in if they like. Who is managing all the reform? You mentioned tax, telecommunications, immigration, banking, potentially. That's a lot to happen. Is that being done through the Supreme Committee, or is it being done through some other centralized group, or perhaps not on a centralized basis?
No, actually, it's the Supreme Committee. The legal department has taken charge of that project. They are the ones who are coordinating with each entity, meetings with each government organization, agreeing on. The trick on the process is that once you reach an agreement with the government entity, you'll still need to discuss it with FIFA and try and find a common ground. FIFA has their own views, their own requirements, which they believe should be taken into consideration. The government has sometimes different views. And in most of them, I think the SC has done a great job in bridging the gap between both and coming to this conclusion.
These will be by way of like a declarations of the ministries and the like, or agency regulations, or?
The enabling law, what we call the FIFA law, allows each entity to issue an executive decision based on the law to clarify the processes that they are in charge of. Let me give you a simple example. Immigration, for example, the law provides for simple access, non-denial of visas, acceptance in certain circumstances, very limited. So we know that, but we don't know the process on how a person can apply, how a person can get the visa, which document will be considered his visa document. All of that is being drafted and will be issued by the Immigration Department or the Ministry of Interior.
It's a wonderful example to see how that can play out. I would encourage my colleagues, if you have any questions and the like. Zach, do you want to chime in with something? You need to unmute.
I think after all these months, we know how to play this game. No, on this point, I'm happy to defer to my colleagues.
Okay, great. Anybody else? Anybody want to chime in? Yeah, Camilla, please.
Maybe Salman can just touch on, I mean, this is a FIFA law, so it's specific for the tournament. And so, you know, what does he foresee how some of this may play out afterwards in terms of a legacy for football or sport in the region, as far as things like ambush marketing and ticket sales is concerned?
So it's a very good question. This is one of the most difficult issues that we had to go through in the past 6 years. The FIFA law will end by the end of the competition. However, the Security Committee, which is part of the Supreme Committee, had proposed what they call the Major Event Law. This law is supposed to be the legacy of the country. It will deal with all of the aspects that we dealt with in the FIFA law for a short period of time, but it will be the legacy of the country. We have the Asian Games coming, and then I think hopefully the country will try again for the Olympics. We have the Asian Cup as well. We are bidding for that. All of these competitions have almost adopted the same approach of FIFA. They have certain guarantees, certain requirements that the country needs to meet. And I think if that law, the Major Event Law, got passed, I do believe it will be a great legacy for the country, especially when it comes to sports and events.
And so, Salman, do you anticipate then that the Major Event Law, it will take the existing law, okay, and then probably in light of some of the regulations that were enacted or some other developments that have transpired and the need to address them, reflect all of what happened between the time the sports law in Qatar was announced and then through the end of the games?
Well, the Major Event Law grants a wide discretion to certain individuals, a committee that will be formed, the Prime Minister, the Cabinet. Each entity has a power to issue certain guarantees or regulations. However, the law itself regulated the main aspects, the main framework for an event to be hosted. For example, IP issues. Whilst we have a strong IP law in the country, we don't have clarity on enforcement. On certain aspects. Enforcement sometimes take time, whereas, for example, in a World Cup, FIFA, if somebody is selling a counterfeit, the FIFA want him to be removed instantly. They don't want to go through the hassle to file a claim. Damage would have been happened by then. Mm-hmm. But again, it puts the ambush marketing. Let me give you another example, which we discussed in the past heavily. If a fan just jumps the fence and run in the field, what is that? Is it a crime? Is it a violation? What is it? How are you going to prosecute him? How are you going to punish him? All of these aspects that are not very clear under our laws have been actually regulated in the Major Events Law. To be honest, I hope it will be issued soon. Whilst it doesn't have an impact for the World Cup, there is no impact. However, it's a very good law for the country because another aspect of it, that it allows the judicial system, the public prosecution, the courts to mobilize. It gives them more powers to issue certain directives and decisions instantly. it is, I think, it would be one of the best legacies out of the World Cup if it was enacted, legally speaking.
Right. Well, your example of IP is really interesting because of the enforcement issue, as you identified. And if there could, through the World Cup and the associated law, the development of this enforcement regime, that would be profound. I know that our students had a 1-credit course on IP protection earlier this semester, our third-year students, and it was focused a lot on the legacy of IP and the World Cup. And students were to write papers and the like. Well, let's shift the conversation, if we could, away from some of the more strict law to some broader management and policy. And Camilla, you were there in the World Cup in South Africa and the like. What lessons can you take from the experience in South Africa to Qatar in terms of legacy?
Well, South Africa was a wonderful time, so I'm quite happy to to be nostalgic and think back to more than 10 years ago. But I think there are a lot of similarity, despite the very different context for South Africa in 2010. And, you know, as I mentioned, more than 10 years have passed, and how legacy has evolved over the years when it comes to the hosting of major sporting events. There's a lot of similarities that Qatar can take out and learn from the 2010 experience. So I'm going to just very briefly, give some context to South Africans' bid and why we wanted to host the Olympic. Getting ahead of myself, Olympic Games now for the FIFA World Cup was essentially, we were coming out of post-apartheid South Africa. We were isolated from international sport. It was an opportunity not only for socioeconomic transformation in the country to address that agenda, but also really to raise the profile and reposition South Africa as a destination, as a tourism destination, but more importantly, to change the image and the Afro-pessimism on the continent, where, you know, people, when they think of Africa, see images of starving children, HIV, AIDS, for South Africa's issues around safety and security. So very, very negative perceptions. And so how could the World Cup not only serve to change images of South Africa and address its broader transformational agenda, but also how it can serve and change images for the country. So what Salman was talking about in terms of compliance, and I think that's something that's very, very important to understand when we're talking about legacy. Essentially, there are two streams. So the country needs to comply, needs to undertake all those guarantees and deliver on those guarantees. But at the same time, we are trying to leverage the opportunity and build a legacy. So what plans does one put? Legacy doesn't just happen. You know, what plans are put in place to ensure not only that we have positive legacies, because legacy can also be negative, but what legacies do we have what plans do we put in place to achieve those legacies, and how do we sustain it? So as much as we have the emphasis on compliance, we also need to put the necessary plans in place to sustain legacy. And before we can sustain legacy, we have to talk about the actual tournament and the direct impact. So one of the biggest wins for South Africa, and I see for Qatar, from a tourism perspective, is capitalizing on that football audience, attracting new markets. People have perhaps have very limited knowledge of Qatar, and certainly also perhaps some, negative stereotypes about Arab culture, a Muslim country. In a similar way, we had to address perceptions in South Africa, where there are also still people who think there's lions roaming around in our streets. But to give people that opportunity to visit a destination, is really, really key. So creating positive experiences while people are here, using the opportunity to increase visitor stay and increase opportunities to spend. So it's not just about the football, because the football market, yes, you are going to have your your pure football fans that all they want to do see is football, but you actually, with the World Cup, you attract a wide football audience in terms of friends and family as well. So you need to be able to create those opportunities for people to have a good time. But very importantly, we need to do this in a responsible manner. So issues around responsible pricing and responsible tourism become key, as well as the messaging. So how do you use the World Cup to highlight particular messaging that Qatar wants to achieve? And so that you can create those positive messages. And something that stands out for me in terms of media is like, treat your media like gold. Media needs the positive stories. It's not just about the on-field play, but it's about Qatar as a destination, so you can generate those positive word of mouth. Then I'll just conclude by linking it to the legacy. Legacy is about the structural changes that is left as a consequence of the World Cup. So in terms of Salman's example was very on point in terms of, the major events law, if it comes to fruition based on the FIFA experience. So we're looking at all those structural changes that has taken place as a result of the event. So, beyond the physical, tangible infrastructure, how do we harness this human capital development, social development, and also from a policy governance and an IP perspective. And I think that is important, that is critical in terms of how we sustain all the positive benefits that come out of the World Cup.
I follow up on that, and my colleagues, feel free to chime in and unmute. If you unmute, I'll call on you. Okay. But did South Africa have like a Supreme Committee like they have here in Qatar?
Yeah, it's evolved since in the past 10 years in terms of how these committees are structured. Supreme committees based on really London 2012, and we were prior to that, but we did have what was called the South African Organizing Committee.
Okay, great. Zach.
Well, first of all, I want to tell Camilla that while she might be concerned with people imagining lions walking through the streets of Cape Town, you might know this quite well-known photo from a few years ago of a tiger wandering across the Doha Expressway. So if any country is concerned with wild animals on the streets, maybe it's Qatar. But a question for you. I mean, we're sort of identifying different legacy buckets, right? So there's the hard infrastructure that is easily measured. There are legal and policy changes, some of which endure, some of which sort of foment different ways of thinking about law. There are the kind of the reputational concerns that you talked about, how people perceive South Africa, how people perceive Qatar or the Arab world. I'm just, as someone who's worked in this, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what you think either are just the 2 or 3 most sought after legacies, or what you think could be the most enduring legacies that leave an imprint on Qatar in the aftermath of the event itself.
Yeah, the one thing I would say is that intangible legacy about changes of perceptions in terms of, and I think possibly one of the things that I didn't mention, and now you've given me the opportunity to do so, was in terms of, when South Africa hosted 2010, there was very, very, up until that point, we had this unequal distribution of mega events, so mostly in the Western world, and so people didn't really give Africa a chance, right? And the fact that we did it relatively successfully and coming off the back of Germany 2006, and we all know Germany is, super efficient, but for a country like a developing country like South Africa to pull it off relatively successfully spoke to the capacity and the capability of a nation. Qatar has the added challenge in terms of it being a compact World Cup, and so that will also speak volumes of Qatar's capability, besides the changing of perceptions, which I see in terms of being exposed to Arab hospitality and the culture.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? We're starting to get some of the questions in the chat room, and I would encourage the audience to chime in as they like, and we will get to them. There's a question here, and maybe this could be for anybody on the panel so far, or anybody, whether you've spoken or not. I think, and perhaps Salman may be the best for this, but the issue of the labor reforms, and we've seen substantial labor reforms in the country, and the question is, what will happen after the World Cup? This is a question I think that is front and center in everybody's mind, and then I'll shift to Dr. Muna on the role of the media. But go ahead, yeah.
If my colleagues allows me, look, the reforms of labor market had nothing to do with the World Cup. They started before the World Cup. The World Cup expedited it, for sure. Hosting the World Cup expedited that process to that reform to happen, but it has nothing to do with the World Cup. And I do believe the nation, the public, and everybody around is going to get used to it. Change is not easy, whether a positive or negative change. It's not easy to people. I think they will get used to it, and I think these reforms, they were recognized internationally, regionally, and I think locally we do recognize them, and they are a necessity. I believe it's a normal evolution of the process, but I don't believe they're going to change after the World Cup, or having the World Cup will impact them.
Great. Camilla, you have your hand up. Is it still live? Yeah, go ahead.
I would have said that was the third one. I know Salman said it's not related, but certainly the World Cup has pushed it along. And I think with particularly with our negative Western media, that does receive a lot of attention. And I think had the spotlight not been on Qatar for the World Cup, we would not, the reforms would have not have been where it is to this point. So I think, it's partly attributed, and I think that would have been my third big legacy.
Great. Thank you. Well, Dr. Muna, Dr. Camila was talking about the media. She mentioned it a couple of times. I think Salman may have mentioned it as well. You've been looking at issues about sports and the media. What are some of the major developments in Qatar over the past year in this area?
Thank you, Dr. Susan. So please allow me to speak in Arabic. I prepared my in Arabic. So بخصوص حقوق البث والإعلان، إذا بنتكلم عن الفيفا، فوفقا يعني آخر تحديث في قانون الصادر في 2021 بخصوص تدابير استضافة كأس العالم، فهذا القانون أعطى الحقوق الخاصة بالإعلام، حقوق البث والإعلان والترويج ونقل الفعاليات للفيفا، ويعني هي فقط حصرية للفيفا، ولا يستطيع أي شخص آخر القيام بالأنشطة المتعلقة ببث الفعاليات وترويجها والقيام بأي خدمات إعلامية إلا عن طريق الفيفا، ويعني الحصول على ترخيص من الفيفا للقيام بهذه الأنشطة. والفيفا القيام بهذا الحق أو لمن تفوضه من المتعاقدين معها. وطبعا الفيفا أعطت حقوق البث لنقل فعاليات كأس العالم لقناة بي إن سبورت، لها الحقوق الحصرية في هذا الشأن، ولا يجوز لغيرها ممارسة هذه الأنشطة. هذه بخصوص أحدث التطورات التشريعية الخاصة بحقوق البث والإعلان المرتبطة بالفيفا.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muna, for explaining that to us, and particularly the role of BN in sports. So then I imagine that BN Sports is entering into contracts as well for distribution of the rights. And has all of that been done now? Are those all complete, or are we going to be seeing more of them and the like? And the second question I have gets back to the IP issue. You know, particularly for a company like BN, we saw a number of issues relating to its content over the year and the need to protect it. What developments have occurred in that realm?
Thank you very much. بخصوص حقوق الملكية الفكرية الخاصة بالفيفا، وكما قلنا طبعا هي الفيفا تمتلك حقوق الملكية الفكرية بشكل حصري ومنفرد. ومن الأمثلة على هذه الحقوق المنصوص عليها في المادة 14 من قانون تدابير استضافة كأس العالم، وهي اسم وشعار وترنيمة الفيفا، العلامات التجارية الخاصة بالفيفا، تعويذات البطولة، اللوحات الإعلانية، والشعارات الخاصة بالأنشطة وتصاميم الكؤوس، الأعمال الفنية والأدبية، وأي حقوق تسويقية وإعلانية. طبعا هنا كما ذكرنا بي إن سبورت متعاقدة مع الفيفا وفوضتها في استخدام حقوقها الإعلامية، وللفيفا فقط، عفوا البي إن سبورت فقط هنا الحق يعني بعد الحصول على موافقات من الفيفا أنها تعيد أو تبيع بعض هذه الحقوق للغير، خاصة حقوق البث للفعاليات. الآن طبعا ليست لدي فكرة إذا قامت بالفعل البي إن سبورت بالتعاقد مع جهات أخرى في هذا الخصوص. هذا ممكن يتضح قبيل استضافة البطولة. فهذه المعلومات المتوفرة حاليا. فالناقل الرسمي حاليا بي إن سبورت، وأعتقد مع الوقت ستتضح الجهات التي سوف تتعاقد معها بي إن سبورت بخصوص حقوق الملكية الفكرية الخاصة للفيفا، اللي هي الحقوق المرتبطة بالجوانب الإعلامية من إنتاج وتسجيل وإعادة إنتاج للفعاليات الخاصة بالبطولة.
Great. Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions, at least one question coming in Arabic, but I think I've got a good translation on it. And I will get to the question dealing with arbitration and conciliation in just a second. But Dr. Muna, and then for the rest of anyone on the panel as well, there's a question that came in about, is there a plan in place to combat broadcast piracy in the region?
If you allow me to answer this question, I just want to mention about something in the legislation, the FIFA legislation. The Security Committee should have a plan to maintain the cyber security during the FIFA World Cup. So they have to put the action plan and implementation for such a plan to make sure that the IP rights are secured. So this is one of the main responsibilities of the Security Committee during the FIFA World Cup.
Great, thank you. Well, this I think is good segue into the role of Qatar in the Middle East, in the region. And Salman was talking earlier about potential other games, and of course the ones that are clearly coming, such as the Asian Games. Zach, has Qatar become sort of a sports law hub for the Middle East? Is this correct? And why? And what does this mean going forward?
Yeah, it's an interesting and complicated question, and I want to hear Salman's reflections on this as well. I mean, clearly Qatar is becoming a sport hub through very intentional and consistent investment in the sports sector by the state. Now, I think we'd have to kind of tease out the different component parts of what that means and what it augurs going forward. I think on the, you asked specifically about sport law, and we might even extend that out a bit to questions of sports governance or sports disputes. And I think this is a really interesting question to reflect on. Certainly something that I've been invested in my own work is trying to make the case that Qatar can, is, and should make itself a regional hub for sports law, broadly defined. And that would encompass, for instance, the work of the Qatar Sports Arbitration Foundation, which Salman was integral in leading the development of. And it views, I think it's important in this respect to view sports law, or here we're talking more about sports disputes, and I think Thomas is going to address that as well, to kind of view sport disputes as part of Qatar's broader investment in disputes more generally. So here we might see sport as somewhat indissociable from what is happening with respect to the new arbitration law, the Qatar International Court, Qatar's engagement with mediation, the new trade and commerce court. So I think you can't draw black and white lines between these different segments. I think they're all part of a somewhat holistic development of an overall ecosystem of which sport is an integral part. I guess what I just kind of pulling the lens back a little bit and making maybe a larger point. I think a challenge for Qatar is to continue to explore ways to leverage its manifest success in sport events, right? Something which culminates or will culminate in the World Cup, but certainly isn't limited to that, and is very much going to continue beyond that, as we've talked about with the Asia Games, a presumptive Olympic bid, and so forth. But to find ways to develop the sports sector in ways that go beyond events, which, however important they are in terms of immediate economic impact and some of these kind of other reputational legacy issues, like Dr. Camilla mentioned, are sort of shots of adrenaline. And I think things like sport law and sport disputes that you mentioned, we might even think about things like sport-related business, are all ways in which all of the attention that galvanizes around events, mega events and major events, can feed into a sports sector that is more diverse and disaggregated and ultimately endurable. And I think we're seeing signs of that in sports law and sports disputes, in the work of the Qatar Sports Tech, with its investment in small and medium-sized sports-oriented businesses, sort of developing hopefully a more enduring business ecosystem that is sport-focused. But again, I think the key is that all of this, while sport-focused, feeds into broader developments and ambitions for the country as a whole that go beyond sport. So I think we need to kind of always see sport as integrated into this more holistic ecosystem.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because clearly mega sport events and the development of the institutions and law and reform and the like. But there are all these other sports activities that are going on that have become the fabric of the country and society. And I think that's important. And another thing that you and I have had conversations about and maybe others may be aware of is just this growing esport market. What do we make of esports, Zach?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really quite interesting because you asked about sports law, and there are different ways to conceptualize what sports law involves, but historically, at least the kind of the leading institutions have been very Eurocentric, and I think that will remain the case in certain respects. And so when Qatar thinks about where it can develop a real advantage and a real leadership position, part of that challenge, I think, is finding emerging markets and emerging industries and emerging opportunities within sport that haven't been captured by the old guard institutions. And esports strikes me as something which is quite primed for that, both because the governance system is very much in flux and undeveloped. Qatar has recently announced the formation of an esport governing body that will exist within the Olympic Committee. So I think there are very substantial and intentional efforts underfoot to develop domestic regulatory protocols. But I think even looking beyond questions of law and regulation, there are opportunities here to view something like esport as lying very much at the intersection of a lot of the different objectives we're talking about. Tech feeding into sports events, feeding into sports law, the convergence of a lot of these different sectors where Qatar has opportunities and critical resources and can, I think, plausibly envision itself to become a genuine industrial hub in the ways that of course it's going to be more difficult in other more established markets with already established institutions.
Mm-hmm. Great. And of course, my colleagues, if you want to chime in on this subject, please feel free to put Salman, go ahead. Yeah.
Susan, I just need to, I would like to basically give an example of what actually Zach said. I agree with him. Qatar still is a developing, at least in the legal infrastructure for sports. We still have a lot to do there. But I wanted to touch base on the sports court and the players union and the other institutions when it comes at least to football. Aspire, as you know, is a very good example of how you can create an environment that will enrich and nurture a star athlete who would basically win. However, Aspire's work would not be complete without the Qatar, for example, Qatar Football Federation or the other federations. Recently, in the past 4 years, there was a full reform for at least the football governing bodies. And I was lucky to be involved in establishing the first, not a players' labor union, the first labor union in the country. We don't have unions. However, we have Qatar Players Association, which actually acts as a union in the country. And then the establishment of Qatar Sports Arbitration Foundation, which came as a result again, and it goes to Dr. Camilla's point, that the World Cup encourages everybody to try and adopt the best practices. The QSAF was modeled after CAS, the International Court of Sports, and it acts in a similar way, however, for the local domestic sports. In the past, I used to play football. In the past, players had limited access. So they had certain committees to file complaints to that are part of the federation. They don't have autonomy and independency as is now with QSAF. The cooperation between Aspire and Qatar Football Federation and the other federations, it led to, on a sports related matter, it led to victories, whether Mu'taz Barsham winning the Olympic medals or our football team which won the Asian Cup. It was the first in our history. Without that cooperation between these organizations and harmony, there will never be the ability to build a sportsman who is aware of his legal rights, who's aware of his accessibility to legal rights. And I think this is where the union now is trying to make players aware of their rights. I mean, the court was activated in 2018. So far, I think we have almost 20 cases that have been decided, the majority of which are players seeking their rights of the clubs, which I envisage is a good indication, because it shows that once you have the correct corporate governance and structure, every component of the game will be more relaxed into participating in it without any tension.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of the development, within dispute resolution clearly, but also well beyond that in terms of governance, the way you just described it. A couple of the remarks here have focused on dispute resolution. I'd like to bring Tom into the conversation. We just heard about the local court here, and there was a question that came in that I think is going to be relevant to the first question I'm going to ask you, Thomas, and that is we also heard of the Court of Arbitration for Sport. What role will it be playing in the World Cup issues that come up during the World Cup, or perhaps any other major sports events?
Susan, thank you for that question, and thanks for inviting me to take part in this webinar. I'll answer that question at the end, if I may. I think it might make sense to give a brief overview of what the CAS is all about, and then I can put my answer in at the end in that context. So the CAS goes back to 1984. It was started with a view to getting in place a specialist organisation that could resolve sports-related disputes through arbitration and mediation. I'm just going to be focusing on arbitration. It's headquartered in Lausanne, and it's unaffiliated with any sports organisation. It's genuinely independent, and it has its own rules to govern arbitration in the same way that any institutional arbitral body has its own rules, such as the LCIA or the ICC. And you agree to arbitrate under the CAS rules in the same way that you'd agree to arbitrate under any other body. You can either have a specific arbitration agreement in your institutional documents, such as your articles of association of the sports organisation, or you can have a separate agreement outside that by which you agree to arbitrate your disputes under the CAS rules. There are three languages in which you can undertake a CAS arbitration: French, English, and Spanish. With permission of CAS, you can agree to another language. They're seated in Lausanne, where, as I say, the CAS is based. The sort of disputes that can be resolved by CAS are pretty broad-ranging. I mean, they may be directly related to sports, so disciplinary issues, anti-doping, which I'll come to, or what might properly be described as indirect matters relating to sports, such as broadcaster rights or IP. And any individual or legal entity can bring a claim before CAS. It might be a person, it might be a club or a sports federation. And there are four types of arbitration, which I'll quickly canter through. You've got the ordinary arbitration procedure, you've got the appeals arbitration procedure, you've got the anti-doping arbitration procedure, and finally, the ad hoc procedure. Taking those in order then, so the ordinary arbitration procedure is the sort of arbitration process that anyone that does arbitration would be routinely familiar with. It deals with contractual disputes or torts, it's confidential, you can agree the substantive law, in default of which it's Swiss law, and the process follows the usual course of any institutional arbitration. You have a request, you have a response, and then you have the subsequent pleadings. Interestingly, you can have an expedited procedure, which is also available under the ICC rules, so you can get through things quickly if the circumstances are appropriate for that. At the end of the day, you have an award. It's got to be reached on a majority basis. It's got to be written, dated, and signed. And the award is final and binding, and the grounds on which you can seek to set it aside in the Swiss Federal Court are pretty limited. You can't appeal on a point of law at all. That's a good thing and a bad thing. It cuts both ways. Of course, if you're the party that has an unfavourable decision, you're broadly stuck with it, even if the tribunal has reached a decision which is bad in law. All the grounds of appeal that you've got are essentially the traditional ones that you tend to find in relation to incorrect rulings on jurisdiction, improper constitution of the arbitral tribunal, violation of the right to be heard, violation of Swiss public policy. Even if you can get within the four corners of any of those grounds, you can't even bring an appeal if you as a party have no domicile or habitual residence or business establishment in Switzerland, or where the right to appeal has been excluded. But on that point, Swiss organisations seated in Switzerland are not permitted to request their athletes to waive their right of appeal to the Swiss courts. So the appeal arbitration procedure, just briefly, this deals with matters such as doping and other disciplinary matters such as match fixing or match violence. And what happens is that these matters are dealt with at first instance by the relevant court, the relevant competent sports authority, and then you use the appeal procedure to appeal against that decision. And the way that the procedure is governed is under the rules of the relevant organisation or under Swiss law. You've got 21 days from the decision being handed down to the relevant body to get your appeal on. Again, you've got a system whereby there is an award which is rendered on a majority basis. It's got to be in writing, and it's final and binding on the parties, subject to the grounds that I've just outlined in respect of the ordinary procedure. Unlike the ordinary appeals awards, though, these awards under the appellate process are not confidential, and they're usually followed up by some form of press release. So moving on to anti-doping, the anti-doping system process is a first instance process. And what's happening here is you're using the process to conduct proceedings and issue decisions where an alleged anti-doping rule violation has been alleged, and you're using the process to deal with that. You can appeal any decision that you don't like against a ruling of the anti-doping tribunal to the CAS Appeals Arbitration Division within 21 days. And again, you have the same rights of appeal as in the other two bodies. The elements of the case remain confidential, save that there can be a press summary which is produced if there is no challenge to the award. And that's usually the case if there is a sanction imposed in the award. And then finally, you've got what's known as the ad hoc procedure. And these ad hoc procedures are very useful. They're essentially designed and capable of resolving in a final manner issues that arise immediately before or after an event within the time restrictions that respect the time schedules of each specific competition. The common thing with each of these four procedures is that you can take your award and you can enforce it under the New York Convention, as you can with any award which is rendered in a country seated, which has the New York Convention applicable to it, which is a party to the New York Convention. Susan, just coming specifically to the question that you asked me, what role can CAS play in the World Cup? Well, the answer is hopefully a very prominent one. I mean, the very quick canter that I've given through all of the various processes that can be involved here just shows that it's very, very well suited indeed to dealing with the sort of matters that you might find arising here. I mean, it's a very important institution, the CAS. The World Cup is a mega event. It would probably want to have recourse to the sort of sophisticated and tried and tested processes and procedures that are implemented under the CAS. There are various sorts of disputes that I think could arise, which would be ripe for determination by the CAS and its procedures, contractual disputes of the sort that I've just been looking at, disputes such as challenging exceptions to the World Cup qualifier timings, qualification and match requirements affected by COVID, event hosting cancellations, player trades or employment issues, IP matters, anti-doping and other disciplinary issues, and finally, it seems to me, broadcaster rights and competition law issues. So absolutely, the CAS is very well suited to dealing with the myriad issues which are likely to raise their head in the context of this huge sporting event. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Thomas. And Faisal, good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Let me just follow up quickly with a question for Thomas, and maybe bring in Zach and Salman and Mona just as lawyers on more of a technical side. But one of the questions from our audience is, what are the conditions, for example, to register a claim in arbitration during the World Cup? And I think the gist of the question is, are we going to be looking at CAS, or are there going to be other bodies here in Qatar, or could CAS temporarily set up arbitration center in Qatar to deal with the kind of issues that could come up during the World Cup?
You could have an ad hoc division set up, absolutely. Or you could just use CAS's ordinary procedures by agreement in the way that I've described. You can either have it within the constitutional document governing your association, or the parties can simply agree as a matter of ordinary contract that CAS will resolve any disputes they might have. I mean, that's the great flexibility of arbitration. You don't actually need physically to be in the particular jurisdiction where the body is venued, or where disputes are routinely seated. You can simply avail yourself by contract, and then you're brought into the whole process.
Zach or Salman or Muna in particular, do you have any sense of whether any local institutions, you guys are working with various local institutions, dispute resolution institutions, would they have the capacity to address the types of disputes that Thomas mentioned that could arise during the course of the games, or is this exclusively within the jurisdiction of CAS? Probably not. I don't know, but I just want to get your thoughts on that.
If I may jump into this,
yeah.
During the World Cup, CAS has the exclusive jurisdiction over the disputes. Mm-hmm. By virtue, as Thomas correctly explained, by virtue of the FIFA status and the local associations statuses. So there is no other organization that would be allowed. And I think QSAF has entered into agreement with CAS, which I do believe is the first of its kind, where they will be using the infrastructure of QSAF during the competition. However, they will have an ad hoc committee coming to Qatar deciding during the games if there were any disputes.
Great, that's wonderful. And that answers a question from one of our audience members, and also a question that I had. Anybody else want to chime in on just dispute resolution? I'll be looking at some of the questions that have come in the chat. I see we have a number of them. But I would like to welcome Faisal Zainal, who is here with us from Esport, and it's good to have you here, Faisal. Glad you're able to take time. He's the project manager at Esport Zone Foundation. We've had a chance to explore a number of issues so far, but one thing that we haven't focused on yet is the specific issue of the benefits here in Qatar arising out of the World Cup 2022 for SMEs. And part of this will be about a conversation we had earlier just about legacy. How can we ensure the benefit will continue beyond the games? And so it's not so much benefit in terms of law, we've been looking at that, but now benefits in terms of just overall value to SMEs.
Yeah, So first of all, Dr. Susan, I just want to apologize for being a bit late to this webinar. I had a bit of a calendar mix-up, hence why I joined at the top of the hour. Apologies for that.
I saw that and I was thinking, I think there's a calendar issue.
I apologize to my esteemed colleagues who are part of the panel as well. Frankly, as you mentioned, yes, I'm a project manager at Aspire Zone Foundation. And of course, my knowledge of sports laws is rather limited in comparison to the people in this panel. That being said, hopefully I can add some value on sort of the business front. And so to answer your question concerning SMEs and the way that the World Cup has affected that, naturally, we've had huge interest from SMEs in the market, both internationally and locally in the World Cup. That being said, I think the opportunities are now, as Qatar is trying to place itself as a global sports hub, are beyond the World Cup. And right now, actually, we're seeing a lot of companies moving to the market that realize that, of course, the tenders and most of the opportunities for the World Cup have kind of been issued and decided. And now we're looking at the post-event calendar. And now Qatar, of course, on top of what we already host, like the tennis, the ATP tennis, the Masters, has added new international events like the Formula One, which is a huge international event, of course. We won the Doha 2030 Asian Games. So there's a nice, a strong calendar for companies moving to the market, SME companies moving to the market that are focused on sports. And I think something that's really interesting that unfortunately, or fortunately, not many people know about right now is the Sport Accelerator, which is a project that we have in Aspire focused on this specific sector. And the Sport Accelerator is a sports business hub where we house up to 80 companies. So we have up to 80 state-of-the-art offices for companies to come and set up at a very reasonable rate. And those offices range from small, medium, all the way up to large being 250 square meters plus. And the idea was, as a state-backed company, to create this project where people can come, A, and set up an office for relatively cheap, B, the building is QFC licensed, so the Qatar Financial Center will provide you their business platform registration services, and namely the biggest benefit of that is that you can own your entity 100% as a foreign owner. And as you know, if you go through the Ministry of Economy, a single window, you have to have a Qatari partner, so that opens up a huge market as well. And then finally, one of the most interesting components of the Sport Accelerator is that we have a incubation program where we invest in companies that are typically small. That being said, we've invested in companies that are all the way up to when they entered the program valued at $3 million. So certainly medium enterprises as well. And we consider them we have a program once a year that we consider 10 companies. We have an application process. It's called Qatar Sports Tech, and I'm happy to share any information post-event in the comments section if anybody's interested in that. And that's all about enticing people to come internationally, with international focus, to come to Qatar, to A, get a free office, B, get mentorship, C, of course, get seed investment or pre-seed investment, and hopefully expand their business in Qatar or beyond, for that matter. So to answer your question, when it comes to SMEs and World Cup and sports, right now I think the Sport Accelerator is kind of at the middle of all of it, and then we're trying to leverage the momentum of the World Cup with what we're doing, but also we're trying to leverage the momentum of the World Cup, but also we're thinking much more beyond that.
Well, a question came in from a member of our audience, and you focused, you're talking about the example of international, but what about, are there incentives for any local startups in the Sport Accelerator?
Right, absolutely. So there's a couple of programs that we have in the Sport Accelerator in partnership, I must say, with the Qatar Development Bank, who are a key stakeholder in all of this, and that, naturally they are kind of the central focal point of Qatar when it comes to incubation, whether it be fintech, whether it be general digital, with their partnership with Ooredoo. And that's kind of what we're forging right now with them as well. And that's kind of the relationship that we have. So QDB as well as Aspire run this incubation program, just to make it clear. And certainly a massive part of what QDB do is investing in local startups and trying to grow the local ecosystem here. So we have a couple of programs. Some are geared more international facing, and some are geared to the local. And don't get me wrong, for those who are locally interested in incubation, they can also enter the international program. There's no let's say, a requirement that you have to be from outside we welcome everybody.
Great. Thank you. Does anybody want to follow up? Anybody on the panel follow up with what Faisal has said? It was very interesting. I would like just a quick follow up. Oh, great. We got some hands up. Yeah. First, Dr. Muna, and then secondly, Dr. Camilla.
Thank you دكتور سوزان. لدي فقط تعقيب على المسألة اللي ذكرها أستاذ فيصل بخصوص الاستثمار الأجنبي. هو سلط الضوء على حضانات الأعمال في دولة قطر بخصوص يعني لمشاريع متوسطة والصغيرة للقيام ببعض الأنشطة التجارية المرتبطة أو الأنشطة يعني التجارية المرتبطة بالبطولة أو الرياضية بشكل عام. أود أن أسلط الضوء سريعا على مسألة الاستثمار الأجنبي في دولة قطر وتشجيعه خلال فترة البطولة. طبعا حسب قانون تدابير استضافة كأس العالم أنه يحق للفيفا وأي منظمات تابعة لها وشركائها التجاريين والمتعاقدين مع الفيفا موردي السلع مقاولي الخدمات ومقدمي الخدمات ومقاولي الأشغال أنهم ينشؤون شركات تجارية في دولة قطر برأس مال أجنبي بنسبة 100% في المجالات المرتبطة بالأنشطة والمرتبطة يعني بالبطولة. وحسب القانون تنتهي هذه الشركات بانتهاء البطولة. طبعا هذا القانون يسري فقط في فترة البطولة اللي هي 10 أيام تسبق البطولة و5 أيام بعد البطولة، أي من 11/11 إلى 23/12/2022. ولكن سمح هذا القانون لهذه المشاريع التجارية المملوكة بنسبة 100% أن تستمر بعد البطولة بناء على اقتراح من اللجنة العليا وبعد موافقة مجلس الوزراء. فهذه أيضا نقطة تحسب لهذا القانون لتشجيعه على الاستثمار الأجنبي. وطبعا هناك ضمانة في هذا القانون أن الحصول على أي ترخيص أو موافقة حسب هذا القانون يجب أن يتم بشكل سريع يتفق ومقتضيات الفترة الوجيزة التي ستقام فيها البطولة. وأنا نعتقد أن أيضا تمديد الأنشطة أو ممارسة هذه الأنشطة التجارية في دولة قطر بعد البطولة ستحظى إن شاء الله بنفس السرعة في هذه الإجراءات، لأن كما ذكرت سابقا هناك إرث لدولة قطر بعد هذه البطولة. لذلك من مهام اللجنة العليا للمشاريع والإرث التفكير حتى في هذه المسألة أن كيف نضمن استدامة واستمرارية بعض الأنشطة التجارية التي لديها فرصة لإثبات نفسها خلال فترة البطولة. شكرا.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mooney, and that emphasis on foreign investment as well. Very important. Dr. Camilla, you had your hand up?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Faisal, for sharing light on the programs in the Aspire Zone and on Qatar Sports Tech. Just a question, based on your experience with SMEs and incubators and the startups that have come into Qatar Sports Tech, the type of challenges that they face, the sport-related startups, have you experienced them in the same way, the same kind of challenges as other general SMEs and startups, and maybe just shed light on some success stories, particularly from local startups?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So how does essentially to tackle it, I think one of the main things you're asking is how does the sports industry or sector kind of differ from other ones? And I think the vision is there for the country to become a sports hub globally. And first of all, Aspire Zone's original strategy, we've kind of reached that. But one of our original strategies was when we set up the organization was to become a reference in sport. And I think we are a reference in sport as an entity. And then more on the macro level as a country, sport is one of the main pillars of the 2030 vision. So at the end of the day, we have a lot of interest from companies and a lot of companies, startups rather, in the sports space, of course, given the momentum of the World Cup as well, and since it's around the corner. So the interest is there, but right now we have a few limited stakeholders in Qatar kind of managing all the sports events and tournaments and what have you, and tends to be where a lot of the money is. And so in that sense, it's still a little bit limited. There's not as many opportunities as perhaps a more traditional industry. That being said, I think where the similarities, and if I may, perhaps it's a critical approach, but where the similarities where there are a lot of similarities rather between sport and typical industries or more traditional industries, is that still the private sector is not where it should be. We of course have a long way to go as far as encouraging the private sector to kind of or entice them and encourage them to open up and essentially really grow. At the moment, it's still very much government or semi-government led when it comes to, again, opportunities, tenders, and what have you. So again, that's why we have the Sport Accelerator here. That's why we have these programs and these incubation programs to try and entice people to really get involved in the private sector and for that SME sector to sort of grow. Now, as far as the success stories we've had, I would point to one that comes immediately because it really was successful across the whole value chain of what Aspire and the Sport Accelerator offers, which is what I can speak about with authority. We have a company called Sponix, which is in sports technology, and they focus on immersive replay technology, essentially first-person replay technology without getting into the ins and outs of it. And as a startup, they were valued at approximately, and I hope the founder isn't too mad with me speaking about his numbers, but they were valued at approximately $3 million when they entered the Qatar Sports Tech program. And by the end of the 6 months program, they were valued at comfortably 8x. And since then, they have taken an office in the Sport Accelerator, which is where the QST, the Qatar Sports Tech program, is housed. So they took a full-time office where they're a paying customer. And today their company has gone from strength to strength, and they're valued at even more than 8x now. It's higher than 10x. So to put that into context, you're talking about tens of millions of US dollars, and they've grown their business successfully through the program and the investment we gave them, and of course the networks that we opened, but also by being here in Qatar, because actually their business is focused on sports broadcast, and we are home to one of the biggest sport broadcasters in the world. So it was fitting that they were here, and they've been able to really leverage the ecosystem that we have. So with that being, circling back to what I said originally, the ecosystem perhaps isn't as robust as we'd like it to be, but Sponix is a fantastic example of what can happen and where we're trying to sort of aim. So,
can I follow up on that? Because what Faisal has described is an incredible process and an investment, a huge investment. Camilla, in South Africa, were these kind of investments being made by the state and thinking long-term in terms of supporting startups as a result of the World Cup?
Yes, definitely, Susan. But as I mentioned, 10 years, there's a lot has happened in the past 10 years. So Qatar has really has been cutting edge as far as technology is concerned. So in the South African context, yes, definitely SMEs, but not not sort of technology driven, but where an area and a potential area which I've seen, which is missing here, and I would have loved to see that come through more, is with craft and design. So in our World Cup, the SMME space was all geared to locally crafted products. So all the gifts for delegations coming in from FIFA over the years. So I'm not talking just during the World Cup period where there's a licensed merchandise program, but all the gifts, all the merchandise, memorabilia that was locally crafted with the World Cup theme was present in South Africa for years prior to the World Cup. And so there's a very good case study on the Cape Craft and Design Institute. Their names changed since then, but they served as a sort of conduit for access to markets for SMEs. So yes, definitely, but in a different context.
That's fascinating because I'm starting to see a lot of the logo and products appearing now. The world, it's becoming in my, every time I'm in the store now, I see more World Cup, and curious about the engagement of local companies in that. We have not had a chance to address a question that is been presented by one of our audience members, and to me it's one I think we all think about, and we live here in the country, and we know how supportive the country is of individuals and the like. But this question is about, I'm going to paraphrase the question if the questioner doesn't mind, but clearly in the country we have laws that deal with terrorism and extremism. And it'd be interesting, Camilla, when you can go think back to local laws in South Africa dealing with security related issues. How are we going to manage these laws with what we anticipate, the questioner says, the festive carnival culture of the World Cup? And we saw a little bit of this when we had the Asia Cup, if I recall, or a couple of years ago, the Asia Cup, where they had these little, areas, designated areas for festivities and the like. And maybe this is a little bit beyond the law, but it's not beyond the law, because this does come down to the question of how dealing with certain legal aspects of the society are going to be matched with expectations of individual freedoms and the like. Is this a question anybody wants to tackle?
Salman. If I may, well, the festivities areas are actually official events zones. So what they call fan zones. There are official fan zones that are commissioned by FIFA, whereby all of the sponsors are only allowed to be there, market themselves, sell, people can go enjoy themselves. And there are fan zones that will be created by the Supreme Committee that are not officially designated by FIFA. So now, I mean, all of the security aspects, if you circle back, as Dr. Hamad said, the law did not specify certain procedures or aspect that needs to be taken in each incident. However, the law in Article 10, I think, empowers the head of security committee, who is the prime minister, to deal with the violations, certain violations that are committed by virtue of hosting the World Cup. For example, one of the mega big issues is alcohol, right? Mm-hmm. There are lots of discussions around alcohol. Alcohol is not being permitted in the whole country by virtue of having a sponsor for FIFA. A sponsor, by virtue of that sponsorship, is allowed to sell their products in the certain area designated by FIFA, which they call commercial areas or commercial restricted areas, and there is a definition for them in the law. So alcohol will be served and sold in these specific officially designated by FIFA areas. However, it's not going to be sold in the Corniche or everywhere in the country. It's still not something that is widely permitted in the country. It's being regulated in certain aspects, licensed organizations or establishments that can sell it. And I think it will continue during the World Cup. The only difference is that a sponsor of the FIFA will be allowed to sell their own products in the designated areas by FIFA.
Right.
And it goes around to every other aspect. The Ministry of Interior, the Prime Minister, there is a huge coordination, which is not specifically in the law. And this is something that once you know it, you admire it. The judicial system is in coordination with the Ministry of Interior to facilitate any violation or any non-compliant with the law that happens during the World Cup, and how they are setting up a process how to deal with it in a way that will not infringe a visitor right. It will take into consideration the competition and the duration of the competition. But there are for sure certain aspects that are not going to be tolerated, like vandalism or stuff like that. But in general terms, there is a huge coordination to basically make people feel welcomed, secured, and happy during the competition.
That's very, very interesting and fascinating to hear about the coordination with the courts and the MOI, because you could see instances in which a happy fan maybe had a little too much and then not engaged in violence, but in public drunkenness or something. You could see how that could be resolved through that system in a way, you know.
One thing, a good example, actually, the handball World Cup that happened in 2015, the Club World Cup that happened in 19 or 18, and then the Arab Cup didn't involve any alcohol, but the handball involved alcohol. There was alcohol because a sponsor was part of that competition. And they were able to deal with it without any enabling legislation. So they allowed it to happen. They controlled it. They had incident of people over drinking, but they dealt with it in a professional way. And the person was not persecuted in a normal way. And he was not persecuted because he had consumed alcohol. And in 2000, I think in the Club World Cup, there was alcohol, I think, in certain areas. And again, a coordination happened between the MOI, the public prosecution, in a very smooth way that nobody felt any issues or any incidents happening during the competition. However, if as a result of drinking alcohol, you would damage a public property, you would for sure be prosecuted for damaging a public property. But it doesn't mean you can, allowing it, it doesn't mean you can do whatever you want.
Exactly.
You still have to adhere to the rules and regulations of the country, which is the case in every country around the world.
Yeah. Dr. Mina, did you want to chime in on this issue? And then Dr. Camilla.
Thank you very much, Dr. Susan. But I think Dr. Camilla raised her hand before me, so if she wants to do
it's okay. It's okay.
Thank you very much. Okay. Again, I'll be speaking and explaining about the security issues here and commenting on what has been mentioned by my colleague, Mr. Salman Al-Ansari. للحديث عن المسائل الخاصة بالأمن والسلامة، وهي طبعا إحدى ضمانات الحكومية التي قدمتها دولة قطر بالفيفا حسب عقد الاستضافة. أضيف إلى ما ذكره زميلي أستاذ سلمان أن فعلا المادة 10 من قانون تدابير استضافة كأس العالم أعطت الصلاحية للجنة الأمنية، هي الخاصة طبعا بأمن وسلامة كأس العالم، التابعة للجنة العليا للمشاريع والإرث، أن تقوم بوضع آلية التعامل مع بعض المخالفات والجرائم التي قد تحدث خلال الفترة الاستثنائية، فترة استضافة البطولة. وتتطلب بالفعل كما ذكر زميلنا أن التعامل معها يكون بشكل قد يكون يعني مختلف أو أسرع من ناحية الإجراءات كذلك، بما أنها فترة وجيزة قد تقع فيها بعض المخالفات. والحقيقة أن القانون لم يذكر مثلا تفصيلا ما هي الجرائم التي ممكن أن تقع بمناسبة استضافة هذه البطولة، ونحن نعتقد أنها متروكة للأحكام العامة حسب ما هو منصوص عليه في قانون العقوبات في دولة قطر، ولكن تحتاج بالفعل التعامل معها بطريقة أسرع. وأعطى هذا القانون أيضا صفة مأمور الضبط القضائي لبعض موظفي اللجنة العليا للمشاريع والإرث والجهات الأخرى في الدولة. بالتأكيد سيكون هناك موظفين من يعني جهات أخرى مختصة بهذه المسائل للتعامل مع المخالفات والجرائم التي سوف تقع في هذه الفترة. طبعا هذا القرار يصدر من النائب العام في الدولة لتحديد هؤلاء الأشخاص. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Muna, and for giving us the specific context within the agreement and the mandate and the like. Dr. Camilla, did you want to chime in on this subject?
Yeah, and also just to link it to the previous one on SMMEs, because it goes back to the entertainment part. So getting that balance between safety and security and having a great experience. The one other area that I never mentioned in terms of SMMEs was about also creating opportunities for vendors. I'm going to give you an example of the city of Cape Town, which had the fan zone near the Cape Town station, and then we had from the fan zone you actually had a fan walk to where the stadium was located, and all along that path there were vendors that could benefit and sell food and drinks, as well as entertainment, at a local level. So that created that space and that entertainment areas. Just in terms of coming to the legal side of things, for South Africa, what emerged out of 2010 for us was something called the Safety in Sports and Recreation Act. That is still enacted today. So that's very important in terms of all our sporting events. But coming to this balance with terrorism, I want to just actually go beyond 2010, and I've been fortunate enough to do research at many other mega events. So I did have the opportunity of being in Brazil for the 2014 World Cup and for Rio for the 2016 Olympic Games, and it was very interesting to see how security was dealt with for those two events, because with 2014, prior to 2014, at that stage when they still had the Confederations Cup in 2013, there were a lot of protests. Some of you may remember there were a lot of protests in Rio, and I remember coming from the Maracanã for one of the matches from 2014, and you actually felt scared because the amount of security presence, and it seemed like it was going to kind of spiral out of control. It was quite a scary feeling. Whereas in 2016 with the Olympic Games, maybe it was because we were dealing with football that was like a religion there versus the Olympic Games, which is a whole lot of different sports. But the approach to the security was a lot different, more friendly, more hospitable. So sometimes it also depends on the type of mega event, and of course the particular context in this case, when I was talking about the FIFA World Cup in 2014, that where there were lots of protests leading up to it.
Well, that was very interesting, because I know that I'm sure there's so much training going on right now with the security, how to best deal with fans and the like. My experience has always been the police here are so friendly. They're like, where are you from? What are you doing? And the like, they're mainly walking the streets, just wanting, to have a conversation and be engaged with you and respectful of you. That's been my own personal experience. Well, we're pretty much done with the hour and a half. I would like to thank you all for your wonderful contributions to this session. I think that if anything, we have covered a lot of ground in a short time. We've learned a lot about what's being done in terms of the business infrastructure, government infrastructure, the legal system, and ways in which the country can take the enormous energy and enthusiasm and dedication of resources into the games, and to benefit as we are benefiting daily, but also in the long term. And I think as we heard, instances in which a lot of this progress is unrelated to the games. The games themselves can help propel, but there's enormous dedication and goodwill to make it all a success. So with that, I would like to thank each of you again for taking time to be with us today. Salman, always so good to see you. Thomas as well. Dr. Muna, wonderful to have you. Camilla and Zach, my colleagues. Nice to have you on the panel, and Faisal too. Keep up all your good work over there at Aspire Zone. It's exciting. And for all our members of the audience, we encourage you to keep up with HBKU Law, the Qatar Lawyers Association, and the activities we have, but have a wonderful sports day. So thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.